Close your eyes. Picture a medieval queen. You probably see a woman in a velvet gown, standing on a balcony, waving to adoring subjects. She lives in a magnificent castle, a fairy tale fortress of towering spires and grand halls, her life a beautiful tapestry of romance and power. This image is a wonderful, comforting lie, a story we tell ourselves because the reality is far less romantic and far more brutal. The truth is that being a queen in a medieval castle was less of a fairy tale and more of a high-stakes, incredibly uncomfortable job with a terrifyingly high turnover rate. Tonight we're going to pull back the tapestries and expose the cold, hard stone underneath. We're going to walk through the drafty halls, not as a tourist, but as the queen herself. We will explore the brutal truths that Disney conveniently leaves out of the story. We'll discover that her crown was less a symbol of divine power and more a heavy, precarious burden. Her castle was not a palace of comfort, but a prison of stone and duty. Her life was governed not by love, but by brutal political arithmetic and biological imperative. So get comfortable. Let the noise of the modern world fade away. We are about to journey back in time to understand the raw, unfiltered reality of a queen's existence. Forget the fantasy. It's time to learn the truth about what it really meant to wear the crown. Let's start with your new home, the castle. In the movies, it's a breathtaking architectural wonder, a place of warmth, light, and opulence. A place you would dream of living in. This is your first and most fundamental misunderstanding. The reality is much, much colder. The stone walls you see are not just for defense. They are giant, porous sponges for the cold and damp. They radiate a permanent chill that seeps into your bones, a cold that no fire can ever truly conquer. There is no central heating. There is only the damp, seeping cold. You might imagine grand, sweeping windows letting in floods of sunlight. The reality was tiny, narrow slits in the wall called arrow loops, designed for defense, not for views. Any larger windows were luxuries, often covered not with glass, but with oiled cloth or wooden shutters that blocked out the light along with the wind. Your world, as a queen, would be one of perpetual twilight. The primary sources of light were sputtering candles made of foul-smelling tallow, animal fat, or smoky, expensive beeswax. The great halls were vast caverns of shadow, the air thick with smoke from the central hearth that never quite found its way out. And the smell, oh, the smell. Forget potpourri and fresh flowers. Your castle is a symphony of odors, none of them pleasant. The rushes on the floor are a perfect example. They were strewn to absorb spills, food scraps, and whatever else fell. They were rarely changed, creating a festering, semi-composted mat underfoot. Then there's the sanitation, or rather, the complete lack of it. The toilet, known as a garderobe, was often just a stone seat with a hole that emptied directly down the side of the castle wall into the moat below. The smell in summer was a constant, inescapable companion. And you are never alone. Privacy is a modern invention. Your chambers are constantly filled with ladies-in-waiting, servants, political advisors, and guards. They are there when you wake, when you dress, when you eat, and when you sleep. Your life is a public performance from dawn until dusk. Your bed, which seems like a sanctuary, is anything but. It is a massive, curtained structure, not just for warmth, but for a sliver of privacy in a world that offers none. But even here, you are not truly alone. Your most trusted ladies might sleep in the same room. The water you drink and bathe in, if you bathe at all, is often drawn from a well inside the castle walls that could be easily contaminated. Sickness was a constant threat, and a simple infection that we would cure with antibiotics could be a death sentence for a medieval queen. So let's paint a more accurate picture. You are a queen, yes, but you are cold. You live in near darkness, surrounded by unpleasant smells, and the constant chatter of your attendants. You have no privacy, and your magnificent home feels more like a beautifully decorated, drafty cage. This is your daily physical reality. It is a world of profound discomfort, and we haven't even begun to talk about your job. Because being a queen was, first and foremost, a job. A job with one single, overwhelmingly important key performance indicator. This primary duty overshadowed everything else. It was the entire reason for your marriage, your title, and your position at court. It was the cold, hard currency of your value as a woman and as a queen in this brutal world. Your entire future depended on it. That duty was not to rule, not to advise, and not to be loved. It was to produce a male heir. That's it. You were, in the starkest terms, a vessel for the dynasty. Your body was not your own. It belonged to the kingdom and its future. Failure to produce a son was not a personal disappointment. It was a political catastrophe. It could lead to you being cast aside, divorced, imprisoned, or worse. It could plunge the entire kingdom into civil war. The pressure was immense, constant, and inescapable. Now that you understand your environment and your primary objective, let's meet some of the women who had to navigate this brutal reality. Their stories are not fairy tales. They are lessons in survival, ambition, and the terrible price of wearing a crown. Let's talk about your career path. How does one become a queen? It's not through a whirlwind romance or a chance meeting at a royal ball. It's through a contract, a political negotiation, where you are the primary asset being traded. You are a living, breathing treaty, a seal on an alliance between two powerful families or nations. Your personal feelings are not a factor. In fact, they are entirely irrelevant. You will likely be married to a complete stranger, a man chosen for you based on the strategic value of his lands, his army, or his claim to a throne. You might meet him for the first time just days before your wedding, or in some cases not until the ceremony itself. The man you are bound to for life could be old, cruel, stupid, or simply someone you find utterly repulsive. It does not matter. Your duty is to smile, accept, and prepare for the consummation that will hopefully lead to that all-important male heir. Consider the case of Isabella of Valois. She became Queen of England in 1396. It sounds like a grand title, the pinnacle of success for a young noblewoman. The brutal truth? She was 6 years old when she was married to King Richard II, a man in his late 20s. Imagine being a small child, taken from your home, your family, and your language, and shipped to a foreign country to be the wife of a grown man. Her marriage was a purely political act, designed to secure a truce between England and France. She was a queen, before she could likely even spell the word, a child playing with her dolls in the royal court of England, while the political future of two nations rested on her tiny shoulders. Her story isn't an anomaly. It's a stark example of the reality for many high-born girls whose childhoods were sacrificed on the altar of diplomacy. Now let's assume you've been married off and have arrived at your new cold, smelly castle. Your primary function, as we've established, is to produce an heir. This wasn't a private family matter. It was a public obsession. The entire court, and indeed the entire kingdom, watched your belly with hawk-like intensity. Every month that passed without news of a pregnancy was another month of mounting pressure and whispered gossip. Your fertility was not a personal journey. It was a subject of national debate. If you struggled to conceive, it was seen as your failure, a sign of divine displeasure, or a weakness in your character. The blame would fall squarely on you, the queen, never on the king. Your value was directly and cruelly tied to the functioning of your womb, and you were reminded of it every single day. And then comes the act of childbirth itself. Today, it's a medical event that, while challenging, is overwhelmingly safe in most parts of the world. In the medieval era, it was arguably the most dangerous moment of a woman's life. For a queen, it was a battle she had to fight repeatedly. Every pregnancy was a roll of the dice with her own life. Childbed fever, a postpartum infection, was a terrifyingly common and swift killer. Hemorrhaging, obstructed labor, and other complications that are now manageable were often fatal. The doctors of the time had little understanding of hygiene or modern medical practices, and their interventions could often do more harm than good. A queen was expected to face this mortal peril again and again, producing heir after heir until her body finally gave out or she was lucky enough to survive into menopause. Let's look at one of the most formidable women of the Middle Ages, Eleanor of Aquitaine. She was a powerhouse, a duchess in her own right, and queen consort to two of the most powerful kings of her time, Louis VII of France and Henry II of England. On paper, she was a success story, but look at her reproductive career. She gave birth to 10 children over a span of more than 20 years. 10 times she faced the life-threatening ordeal of childbirth. While many of her children survived to adulthood, the physical and emotional toll is unimaginable. Her life was a constant cycle of pregnancy, birth, and recovery, all while navigating the treacherous political waters of 2 different royal courts. Her power, immense as it was always intertwined with and dependent on her role as a wife and, most importantly, as a mother to sons. The grim reality is that even if you survived childbirth, there was no guarantee your child would. Infant and child mortality rates were staggeringly high. It was common for a queen to give birth to multiple children only to watch many of them die from illness or accidents before reaching adulthood. Imagine the profound grief of losing a child, a pain that is universal and timeless. Now imagine experiencing that grief while simultaneously knowing that the death of your infant son has just jeopardized your own position, your safety, and the stability of the entire kingdom. Your personal sorrow was inextricably linked with political failure. There was no time to mourn privately. You had to get back to the job of producing the next heir, a replacement for the one you just lost. But what if you were supposed to be more than just a queen consort? What if, by birthright, you were the designated ruler, the actual, reigning monarch? Surely then, you would hold all the power. This is where we meet Empress Matilda, daughter of King Henry I of England. Her story is a brutal lesson in medieval gender politics. After her brother died in a tragic shipwreck, her father, King Henry, did something unprecedented. He named Matilda as his heir and made all his barons swear an oath to support her claim to the throne. On paper, her succession was secure. She was the rightful ruler, the anointed queen. But paper has very little power against ambition and prejudice. When King Henry I died in 1135, the promises made to him and his daughter evaporated almost instantly. The barons, who had sworn their loyalty to Matilda, conveniently forgot their oaths. A woman ruler? It was seen as unnatural, an affront to the proper order of things. They preferred her male cousin, Stephen of Blois, a man with a much weaker claim to the throne, but the crucial advantage of being a man. Stephen seized the crown, and the country plunged into a devastating civil war that would last for nearly 2 decades, a period known grimly as the Anarchy. Matilda had the birthright, the legal claim, and the determination, but she was fighting against a system that was fundamentally designed to exclude her from ultimate power simply because of her gender. Matilda fought relentlessly for her inheritance. She was no delicate flower. She was a warrior queen who led armies and strategized with her commanders. Yet she was constantly judged by a different standard than her male counterpart. When she acted with the same decisiveness and authority as a king, she was condemned as arrogant, haughty, and unfeminine. At one point, she had Stephen captured and was on the verge of being crowned in London, but her perceived arrogance alienated the citizens, and she was driven from the city. She had to do everything a man would do to win a crown, but she was punished for not behaving like a proper woman while doing it. It was an impossible double standard, a game rigged against her from the start. The most famous story of Matilda's struggle encapsulates her harrowing reality. In the winter of 1142, she was besieged and trapped by Stephen's forces in Oxford Castle. With supplies dwindling and surrender seeming inevitable, Matilda orchestrated a daring escape. Dressed entirely in white to camouflage herself against the snow-covered landscape, she and a few loyal knights were lowered from the castle walls on ropes. They crept past the enemy sentries, crossed the frozen River Thames on foot, and walked for miles through the bitter cold to the safety of Wallingford. It's a tale of incredible bravery and resilience, but it's also a story of a rightful queen forced to flee like a fugitive in her own kingdom, simply because the men in power refused to accept her authority. Matilda never was crowned Queen of England. Although she eventually secured the succession for her son, who would become the formidable King Henry II, her own right to rule was denied. She was the queen who should have been, a constant reminder that in the medieval world, a woman's claim, no matter how legitimate, was always considered negotiable. Her life demonstrates the brutal truth that even when a woman was born to rule, she would have to fight twice as hard as any man for a crown that the world believed she was unfit to wear. Her legacy is one of strength and tenacity, but also one of profound injustice, a testament to the ironclad patriarchy of the age. Now, let's turn to a different kind of queen. Not one who was denied a throne, but one who was married to a king who was, by all accounts, a disaster. This is the story of Isabella of France, the wife of Edward II of England. Her tale reveals what could happen when a queen, pushed to the absolute limit, decided to stop being a pawn and start playing the game herself. Isabella arrived in England as a young, intelligent, and beautiful princess, ready to be a model queen. She was the daughter of a powerful French king, a desirable political match. Her husband, Edward II, however, was less interested in his capable new wife and more infatuated with his male favorites, most notably a man named Piers Gaveston. Imagine Isabella's situation. She was in a foreign land, married to a king who openly preferred the company of another man. Edward showered Gaveston with titles, lands, and jewels, many of which were part of Isabella's own dowry. Gaveston, in turn, treated the queen with contempt and mockery. She was neglected, humiliated, and politically sidelined. The barons of England were furious at the king's behavior, not out of sympathy for the queen, but because they saw Gaveston as a threat to their own power. Isabella was trapped in the middle of a toxic court. Her dignity eroded daily, her role as queen reduced to a mere formality. She was enduring a marriage that was not just loveless, but actively insulting. For years, Isabella endured this humiliation with patience and diplomacy. She acted as a mediator between her husband and his rebellious barons. She gave him 4 children, including a male heir, the future Edward III. She fulfilled her part of the bargain completely. She was, on paper, the perfect queen. But there is a limit to human endurance. The final straw came when Edward II acquired a new set of favorites, the Despencer family, who were even more grasping and power-hungry than Gaveston had been. They isolated Isabella completely, seized her lands, and even took her children away from her. The king she was bound to had become her tormentor and her jailer in her own court. In 1325, Isabella was given a golden opportunity. She was sent to her homeland of France on a diplomatic mission to resolve a dispute with her brother, the French king. Once she was safely on French soil, away from her husband's control, she refused to return. It was a stunning act of defiance. In Paris, she began to gather support from exiled English nobles who opposed Edward II. It was there that she began a relationship with one of them, the ambitious and charismatic Roger Mortimer. Together, they became lovers and political allies, and they began to plot something unthinkable, an invasion of England to depose a divinely appointed king. In 1326, Isabella and Mortimer landed in England with a small mercenary army, but they didn't need a large one. The country, fed up with Edward's disastrous rule, and the greed of his favorites, rose up to support her. Her invasion was less of a conquest and more of a popular liberation. The Despensers were captured and brutally executed. King Edward II fled, was eventually captured, and was forced to abdicate the throne in favor of his and Isabella's teenage son. Isabella, the neglected and humiliated wife, had returned as a conqueror. She had done what no queen had ever done before. She had overthrown her own husband and king. Because of her actions, Isabella was given a fearsome nickname by her detractors, the She-Wolf of France. It was meant to be an insult, a way of painting her as a monstrous, unnatural woman who had usurped a man's power. But the name also speaks to her ferocious strength and her refusal to be a victim. She ruled England as regent for her young son, alongside her lover Roger Mortimer. Her story became a cautionary tale, but also a legend. While her own rule eventually came to an end when her son came of age and seized power for himself, Isabella had shattered the mold of the passive, obedient queen. The fate of her husband, Edward II, is shrouded in dark rumor. He died in captivity at Berkeley Castle. The official cause was natural, but legends quickly spread of a more gruesome end. The most infamous story, likely propaganda designed to further tarnish her she-wolf image, is that he was murdered by having a red-hot poker inserted into his body. While almost certainly untrue, the persistence of this horrific rumor speaks to the sheer shockwaves that Isabella's actions sent through medieval Europe. She proved that a queen was not just a decorative piece in the political game. If pushed too far, she could become its most dangerous and unpredictable player. Let's step back from the high drama of invasions and depositions and consider the day-to-day existence of a queen. What did she actually do all day? It wasn't sitting on a throne looking regal. The queen was the head of a massive, complex, and incredibly expensive organization, the royal household. She was, in modern terms, a CEO or a chief operating officer of a huge and sprawling enterprise. Her job was to manage the logistics of the court, a constantly moving city of hundreds, sometimes thousands of people. This included her ladies-in-waiting, servants, clerks, knights, and all their attendants. It was a monumental administrative task. She was responsible for the budget, the accounts, and the supplies. Imagine having to provision a small town that is constantly on the move, as the court often traveled from one royal castle to another. She had to ensure there was enough food, wine, and ale. She managed the purchase of cloth for clothing, the care of the horses, and the payment of wages. She would have spent hours each day in meetings with her steward, her treasurer, and her chamberlain, poring over ledgers and making decisions about resource allocation. It was a job that required intelligence, organization, and a keen eye for detail. The fairy tale queen who spends her days singing to birds is a fiction. The real queen spent her days worrying about the price of hay. Beyond the household, a savvy queen also had to be a master of what we now call soft power. While she held no official political office, her influence could be immense if she played her cards right. Her primary tool was patronage. By granting favors, positions at court, or advantageous marriages to the children of powerful nobles, she could build a network of allies who were loyal to her personally. This was a delicate and often treacherous game. Favoring one noble family could earn the eternal enmity of another. She had to navigate these complex webs of loyalty and rivalry with skill and subtlety, always working to strengthen her own position and the security of her children. The queen also served as a primary point of access to the king. People who wanted a favor, a judgment, or a pardon from the king would often petition the queen first, hoping she would intercede on their behalf. This made her an incredibly important figure at court. She was a gatekeeper, an advocate, and an intercessor. A wise queen could use this position to dispense justice, build goodwill, and subtly shape the king's decisions. However, it also put her in a precarious position. If she advocated for an unpopular cause or person, she could draw the king's wrath or the suspicion of the court. Every request she supported was a political calculation with potential rewards and serious risks. Let's talk about the women who surrounded the queen, her ladies-in-waiting. In films, they are depicted as loyal best friends and confidants, a sisterhood offering comfort and support. While genuine friendships could and did form, the reality was far more complicated. These women were not chosen by the queen for their sparkling personalities. They were the daughters and wives of powerful noble families, placed in the queen's household for strategic reasons. They were there to advance their own family's interests, and their loyalty was often divided between the queen they served and the powerful father or husband who sent them there. These ladies-in-waiting were both the queen's companions and her keepers. They were a constant source of court gossip, political intelligence, and social connection. A wise queen could use her ladies to build her network of allies and stay informed about the shifting loyalties of the court. But they were also, in a very real sense, spies. Everything the queen said, everything she did, every mood swing, every private conversation was observed, noted, and likely reported back to their families. The queen had to be constantly on her guard, even in her most private moments, as the women sharing her chambers were also key players in the court's political games. True privacy was a luxury she could never afford. The queen's relationship with the church was another critical and complex aspect of her life. She was expected to be a model of piety and religious devotion. Public displays of faith were a crucial part of her role. She would found convents, go on pilgrimages, and patronize religious orders. This was not just about personal belief. It was a performance of queenship. Her piety reflected on the king and the kingdom, projecting an image of divine favor and moral righteousness. A reputation for holiness could be a powerful political asset, earning her the love of the common people and the respect of the powerful clergy. However, this relationship with the church could also be a source of conflict. The church was a massive, independent power in medieval Europe, often at odds with the ambitions of secular rulers. A queen could find herself caught between her loyalty to her husband, the king, and her duty to God, as interpreted by powerful bishops or the Pope himself. A famous example is the clash between Henry II and Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury. This conflict placed Henry's wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, in an incredibly difficult position, navigating the treacherous waters between her powerful, hot-tempered husband and the unbending authority of the church. A misstep could have disastrous spiritual and political consequences. Let's revisit the physical reality of the castle, but focus on hygiene and health. We imagine royalty as being clean and pristine, but medieval standards of cleanliness were radically different from our own. Bathing was an infrequent and laborious event. A wooden tub would have to be dragged into a chamber and filled with buckets of water heated over a fire. It was a luxury, not a daily routine. People, including queens, often went long periods without a full bath. They would wash their hands and face, but the modern concept of daily showers was centuries away. The air would have been thick, with the smell of unwashed bodies, smoky fires, and imperfect sanitation. When a queen fell ill, her prospects were grim. Medieval medicine was a blend of folk remedies, superstition, and theories inherited from the ancient Greeks, particularly the idea of the four humors. Illness was thought to be caused by an imbalance of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. The cures were designed to rebalance these humors and were often brutal and ineffective. A queen suffering from a fever might be subjected to bloodletting, where a physician would deliberately cut a vein to drain excess blood, weakening her when she most needed her strength. Potions and poultices were made from a bizarre array of ingredients, some harmless, some toxic. The queen's diet, while plentiful, was not necessarily healthy by modern standards. The wealthy ate vast quantities of meat, often heavily spiced to disguise the taste of decay, as preservation methods were limited. Fresh vegetables and fruits were seasonal and often viewed with suspicion by physicians, who believed they could cause imbalances in the humors. The water was often unsafe to drink, which is why ale and wine were the beverages of choice for everyone, including children. While the queen would never starve, her diet could contribute to a host of health problems, from digestive issues to gout, with no effective medical treatments available. Let's consider the psychological toll of this existence. Imagine living in a state of constant, low-grade fear. Fear of childbirth, fear of your child dying, fear of falling ill, fear of political intrigue, of a rival faction at court, or of your husband's displeasure. Fear of being cast aside for a younger, more fertile wife. This was the background noise to a queen's entire life. She had to project an image of serenity and confidence while navigating a world filled with danger, both visible and invisible. The mental resilience required to survive, let alone thrive, in such an environment is difficult to comprehend. A queen was also a symbol. Her clothing, her jewels, her every public appearance were meticulously curated to project an image of power, wealth, and legitimacy. Her wardrobe was a political tool. The luxurious fabrics, the rare dyes, the intricate embroidery, all of it was designed to awe and intimidate, to visually represent the might and splendor of her husband's kingdom. When she appeared in public, she was not just a woman. She was a living embodiment of the dynasty. This meant there were no off days. She could never be seen looking anything less than magnificent, as her appearance was a reflection on the health and status of the entire realm. This constant performance of power came with a profound sense of isolation. Who could a queen truly trust? Her husband's loyalty might be conditional on her fertility. Her ladies-in-waiting were advancing their family's agendas. Her children, once grown, would become political players with their own ambitions, sometimes in direct conflict with her own. Even her own family, back in her homeland, now saw her primarily as a strategic asset in a foreign court. She was surrounded by people, yet fundamentally alone, the still center of a swirling vortex of ambition, loyalty, and betrayal. Let's revisit the idea of the queen as a political pawn through another lens: the Queen Dowager. What happened to a queen after her husband, the king, died? If her son was the new king, she could enter a new phase of immense influence as the Queen Mother, a respected elder stateswoman. But this was not guaranteed. Her power was entirely dependent on her relationship with her son, the new king, and his willingness to listen to her. If her son was weak, or if he had a strong-willed wife of his own, the Queen Mother could be quickly sidelined, her years of service forgotten as the new generation took center stage. If she was a queen consort who had not produced a male heir, or whose husband was deposed, her fate could be much bleaker. She might be sent back to her home country in disgrace, a failed political bargain, or she could be forced to retire to a convent, a genteel prison where she could live out her days in prayer and obscurity, safely removed from the political arena. The most unfortunate could become prisoners of the new regime, their royal status, a threat that needed to be contained. Her value was so intrinsically tied to her husband that his death or downfall could render her instantly powerless and vulnerable. Think of Joanna of Navarre, the second wife of King Henry IV of England. After Henry's death, she initially enjoyed a comfortable position as Queen Dowager. However, her stepson, the famous King Henry V, was preparing for his costly wars in France. Joanna was a wealthy woman, and her stepson coveted her fortune. In 1419, she was suddenly accused of witchcraft and of plotting to kill the king through sorcery. The charges were almost certainly fabricated, a convenient pretext to confiscate her lands and money. She was imprisoned for several years, her wealth seized by the crown, a powerful queen reduced to a political prisoner by the greed of her own stepson. The life of a medieval queen was a paradox. She was simultaneously one of the most powerful women in the kingdom and one of the most constrained. She lived in opulent surroundings, but in profound physical discomfort. She was the center of the court's attention, but was often deeply isolated. She was revered as a symbol of the dynasty, but valued primarily for her biological function. Her life was a constant, high-stakes balancing act, requiring immense strength, intelligence, and luck to navigate successfully. For every queen who is remembered as a great success, there are countless others who were broken by the brutal realities of the role. Consider the pressure of dynastic rivalry. A queen's children were her greatest asset, but they were also potential targets. In a world where the succession could be contested, the existence of her sons was a threat to other claimants to the throne. The Wars of the Roses in England provide a terrifying example of this. The queens of the rival houses of Lancaster and York, Margaret of Anjou and Elizabeth Woodville, saw their sons become the focal point of a bloody, decades-long conflict. Their role as mothers was not just to nurture, but to protect their children from assassination and to groom them for a throne that others were willing to kill for. Margaret of Anjou, the wife of the Lancastrian King Henry VI, was another she-wolf. When her husband suffered from a mental breakdown, she fought fiercely to protect her young son's inheritance against the claims of the House of York. She became a military leader and the heart of the Lancastrian cause, a queen forced by circumstance to become a general. She was reviled by her enemies as a vengeful and unnatural woman, but she was simply a mother fighting for her son's life and birthright in the most ruthless way she knew how. Her story is not one of fairy tale romance, but of blood, steel, and a mother's ferocious will to protect her own. Elizabeth Woodville, her Yorkist rival, faced a similar reality. After her husband, King Edward IV, died, her two young sons, the new king and his brother, were declared illegitimate by their uncle, Richard III. The boys, known as the, quote, princes in the Tower, were taken to the Tower of London and were never seen again. Elizabeth, who had risen from a commoner to Queen of England, saw her entire world crumble. She lost her husband, her crown, and her beloved children in one fell swoop, a victim of the brutal politics of succession. Her story is one of the most tragic in English history, a stark reminder of how quickly a queen's fortunes could turn. So when we strip away the layers of myth and romanticism, what is left? We are left with a woman in a cold stone room who understands that her body is a political tool. We are left with a manager, an administrator, and a diplomat, trying to build a network of allies in a court full of rivals. We are left with a mother, terrified for the lives of her children. We are left with a survivor, navigating a world that simultaneously elevates her and constrains her at every turn. Her crown is not a prize, it is the symbol of her gilded cage. The brutal truth about being a queen in a medieval castle is that it was not a life of pampered ease, but a relentless, high-pressure job. It was a career defined by discomfort, danger, and a profound lack of personal agency. The fairy tale we imagine is a modern invention, a story that sanitizes the harsh realities of the past. The real queens of history were not passive princesses waiting for a prince. They were complex, resilient, and often ruthless women, fighting for survival in a world that was not built for them. So, the next time you see a picture of a medieval queen in her magnificent castle, remember the truth that lies beneath the velvet and jewels. Remember the biting cold that the fire could never quite reach. Remember the constant pressure to produce an heir. Remember the isolation, the political maneuvering, and the ever-present threat of a sudden fall from grace. Remember Empress Matilda in the snow and Isabella of France crossing the Channel with an army. Remember that their lives were not fairy tales. They were epics of survival. The Queen's marriage bed is a perfect symbol of her entire existence. It's a place of great luxury, often draped in expensive fabrics and piled with soft pillows, a symbol of her status. Yet, it is not a place of private intimacy. It is the stage for the most crucial political act she will perform: the conception of an heir. The consummation of a royal marriage was often a semi-public event, witnessed by high-ranking nobles to ensure the marriage was legally valid. Even after that, her bedchamber was never truly private. It was the place where her value to the kingdom was either proven or found wanting, a place of immense pressure and public scrutiny, all disguised under a canopy of silk. Let's consider the food a queen ate. While she would have had access to the rarest and most expensive foods available, the medieval palate was very different from ours. Meats like swan, peacock, and heron were status symbols, often cooked and then redressed in their own feathers to be presented at the table. Dishes were heavily spiced, with expensive imported spices like cinnamon, cloves, and pepper. This was not just for flavor, but as a conspicuous display of wealth. Sugar was also a rare luxury, used as a spice and a status symbol, often molded into elaborate sculptures called subtleties that were brought out between courses. It was a diet designed to impress, not necessarily to nourish. Even the queen's leisure was not truly her own. When she went hunting or hawking, popular pastimes for the nobility, it was a public spectacle, was another opportunity to display the wealth and vigor of the court. When she played chess or listened to a minstrel sing, it was often in the company of her ladies and other courtiers. Her moments of relaxation were still performances, still part of the fabric of court life. The idea of having a private hobby or simply being alone with her thoughts was a foreign concept. Her entire existence, from the moment she woke to the moment she slept, was a public role she could never step away from. The queen's role as a fashion trendsetter was also a tool of statecraft. Her choice of fabrics, colors, and styles would be copied by the noble women of the court and beyond. This was not mere vanity. By importing a certain style from her home country, she could foster a sense of cultural connection and alliance. By wearing cloth produced within the kingdom, she could promote local industry. Her wardrobe was a carefully managed part of her political persona, sending subtle messages about her origins, her loyalties, and the wealth of the kingdom she now represented. Every gown had a purpose beyond simple adornment. Let's not forget the constant travel. While we picture a queen in one magnificent castle, the medieval court was often itinerant, moving from one royal residence to another throughout the year. This was for several reasons. It allowed the king to be seen and dispense justice throughout his realm. It also allowed the castle's primitive sanitation systems a chance to be cleaned out and to air out. For the queen, this meant a life lived out of chests and wagons. It was a logistical nightmare, packing up the entire household, tapestries, furniture, kitchen supplies, wardrobe, every few months to trek for days or weeks along muddy, dangerous roads to the next cold, drafty castle. The very language a queen spoke could be a source of tension. A foreign-born queen would arrive in her new kingdom speaking her native tongue and would have to quickly learn the language of her new court. Her accent, her phrasing, her very identity was a constant reminder that she was an outsider. For some, like Eleanor of Aquitaine, who was a formidable cultural figure in her own right, this could be a source of influence. For others, it could be used against them, a way for their enemies to paint them as foreign and untrustworthy, their loyalties forever suspect because they did not speak the language of the common people. What about a queen's relationship with her in-laws? This could be a minefield of political and personal conflict. A powerful mother-in-law, a former queen herself, could see the new young queen as a rival for influence over the king. The king's brothers and uncles were often powerful nobles with their own ambitions, who might see the queen and her children as obstacles to their own potential claims to the throne. The queen had to navigate this web of family relationships with extreme care, trying to win allies while being wary of those who smiled to her face but plotted behind her back. The family she married into was not a source of comfort, but a new set of political rivals. The role of a queen as a peace weaver is often highlighted. It's true that queens, especially through their family connections to foreign courts, could act as diplomats and mediators, smoothing over disputes and fostering alliances. They were often referred to as the soft face of power, but this role was a double-edged sword. If her efforts at peacemaking failed, she could be blamed for the ensuing conflict. If the alliance she represented fell apart, her own position at court could become untenable. She was celebrated when she succeeded, but was a convenient scapegoat when diplomacy failed, her foreign birth once again making her an easy target for blame. Let's think about the legal standing of a queen. She was not a citizen in the modern sense. She was her husband's subject, but also a figure with her own distinct rights and properties, usually laid out in her marriage contract. These properties, her dower lands, were meant to provide her with an income and security should her husband die. But, as we saw with Joanna of Navarre, these rights were not always respected. A determined king or a hostile court could find ways to strip her of her lands and titles, leaving her powerless. Her security was only as strong as the political will to uphold the contracts that were supposed to protect her. Imagine the sheer noise of a medieval castle. It was not a quiet, contemplative place. The great hall would be filled with the sounds of boisterous knights, barking dogs, the chatter of hundreds of servants, the music of minstrels, and the constant comings and goings of petitioners and officials. The courtyards would ring with the sound of blacksmiths, hammers, the clatter of horses, hooves, and the shouts of men-at-arms at practice. There was no escape from the noise, the bustle, the constant human activity. For a queen seeking a moment of peace, the castle offered very few sanctuaries. A queen's religious life, while a source of power, was also a source of immense obligation. She was expected to spend hours each day in prayer, attending Mass in her private chapel, and observing the fasts and feasts of the church calendar. This was not optional, it was a core part of her public duties. Her confessor, a high-ranking churchman, was a constant presence in her life. He was her spiritual guide, but he was also a politically powerful figure who could influence her actions and report on her piety or lack thereof to the king or even to the Pope. Her very soul was a matter of political interest. Let's consider the emotional labor. A queen was expected to be a serene and calming presence at court, a model of grace and femininity. She had to smile at nobles she despised, show favor to people she distrusted, and maintain a dignified composure even when she was being publicly humiliated or was grieving a personal loss. She had to suppress her own anger, fear, and sorrow to project the unwavering image of queenship. This constant self-regulation, this performance of an idealized role, must have been emotionally exhausting, a heavy mask that she could rarely, if ever, take off. The concept of romantic love, as we think of it, was largely absent from the equation of a royal marriage. While affection and respect could certainly develop between a king and queen over time, the marriage was fundamentally a political and dynastic transaction. The king might have mistresses, and this was often accepted as a matter of course, as long as he was discreet and continued to honor the queen publicly. The queen, however, was held to an absolute standard of fidelity. Any hint of infidelity on her part would not just be a personal scandal, it would be treason, as it could cast doubt on the legitimacy of the royal succession. The double standard was absolute and unforgiving. A queen's education was tailored specifically for her role. She would be taught to read and write, often in several languages, to manage accounts, and to understand diplomacy and court etiquette. She would learn music, embroidery, and other feminine arts, but her education was designed to make her a capable consort, not an independent thinker. She was educated to be a useful and graceful companion to a powerful man, not to wield power in her own right. An overly educated or opinionated woman could be seen as threatening or, quote, unnatural, so her intelligence had to be deployed with care and subtlety. Think about the sheer boredom. Amidst the high-stakes political drama and administrative duties, there must have been long periods of monotonous routine. The endless cycle of meals, prayers, and public appearances. The repetitive nature of the court's seasonal travels. The long winter evenings in a dark, cold castle. While her life was not idle, it was highly structured and often repetitive. The spontaneity and freedom of choice that we take for granted were completely absent from her existence. Every day was governed by a strict calendar of duty and ritual. The queen's relationship with her own children was complicated by their status. They were not just her children, they were princes and princesses of the realm. Their upbringing, their education, and their marriages would be decided by the king and his council, based on what was best for the state. A queen might have to watch her young daughter be sent off to a foreign land to marry a stranger, just as she herself was. She might see her sons become rivals for power. The natural bonds of maternal love were constantly intertwined with and sometimes strained by the cold, hard realities of dynastic politics. The very air a queen breathed could be dangerous. In a world of political intrigue, poison was a real and constant fear. A queen had to be careful about what she ate and drank, and trusted servants would often taste her food before she did. While the actual number of poisonings may have been small, the fear was pervasive. A sudden illness could easily be interpreted as the result of a deliberate act of malice. This pervasive suspicion would have added another layer of stress and fear to her daily life, making her wary of even those closest to her. Even in death, a queen's body was a political object. The funeral of a queen was a major state occasion, a final performance of power and piety. Her burial place, often beside her husband in a grand abbey like Westminster, was a statement of dynastic legitimacy. Her tomb, with its effigy, was designed to project an idealized image of her as a noble, pious, and fruitful queen for all eternity. Her final legacy was as carefully constructed and controlled as her life had been. She was a symbol for the kingdom, from her marriage cradle to her stone grave. Let's circle back to the central myth, the queen as a figure of immense power. The truth is that a queen's power was almost always derivative. It flowed from her relationship to a man, her father, her husband, or her son. She could influence power, she could manage it, and in rare cases like Isabella's, she could seize it. But she almost never possessed it in her own right. Her position was fundamentally precarious, dependent on the goodwill of the men around her and the biological luck of her own body. She was a high-stakes gambler in a game where the house, the patriarchal system, almost always won. The contrast between the queen's public image and her private reality is the heart of the matter. Publicly, she was the epitome of grace, wealth, and divine favor. She was adorned in the finest clothes and jewels, attended by a massive retinue, and treated with elaborate deference and ceremony. But this was a carefully constructed facade. Behind it was a life of physical hardship, political anxiety, and profound personal constraint. She was the most visible woman in the kingdom, and also one of its most tightly controlled. The more splendid her public image, the more pressure she was under to maintain it. Consider the role of rumor and gossip in a queen's life. In a court without mass media, gossip was the primary source of information and a potent political weapon. A whispered rumor about the queen's behavior, her loyalty, or her fertility could spread like wildfire and do immense damage to her reputation. Her enemies could use gossip to undermine her position, and she had very little recourse to defend herself. She had to be hyper-aware of her every word and action, knowing that anything could be twisted and used against her in the court's relentless rumor mill. The queen's charity was an important part of her public role. She was expected to be a patron of the poor and the sick, distributing alms and visiting hospitals or convents. This was known as the Queen's Grace. It was a way of softening the image of the monarchy and fostering a connection with the common people. It reinforced her image as a pious and compassionate mother to the kingdom. But this, too, was a performance. Her charitable acts were public, ceremonial, and designed to enhance her political standing as much as to alleviate suffering. It was another duty in a life filled with them. Let's consider a queen's legacy. How was she remembered? Her reputation was often shaped by chroniclers who were men, often monks, writing with their own political biases. A queen who conformed to the ideal, pious, fertile, and obedient, was praised. A queen who stepped outside of these bounds, who was ambitious or assertive like Matilda or Isabella, was often condemned as unnatural or monstrous. The story of her life that was passed down to history was not necessarily the true story, but a version crafted to reinforce the social and political norms of the time. We are still untangling these biased accounts today. The physical space of the castle itself reinforced the queen's position. The king had his own set of chambers, his council rooms, his public halls. The queen had hers. Her domain was the household, the private sphere, while his was the realm, the public sphere. The very architecture of the castle created a gendered division of space and power. While her role as manager of the household was vital, it was seen as secondary and subordinate to the king's role as ruler and warrior. The stone walls that imprisoned her also defined the limits of her influence. The concept of the king's peace was a cornerstone of medieval rule, the idea that the king's authority prevented the chaos of civil war. The queen's primary role was to ensure the continuation of that peace through the production of a clear male heir. If she failed, or if the succession was disputed, the kingdom could descend into anarchy, as it did during the time of Empress Matilda. Therefore, the queen carried the weight of the entire kingdom's stability on her shoulders. The peace and safety of millions of people depended on her ability to navigate the biological and political lottery of her position. The queen's relationship with the arts was one area where she could exert significant personal influence. As a major patron, a queen could shape the cultural life of the court. She could commission tapestries, illuminated manuscripts, and poetry. She could support musicians and troubadours. This was more than just a hobby. It was a way of creating a legacy and promoting a particular cultural identity. Eleanor of Aquitaine, for example, was a legendary patron of the arts, and her court was a vibrant center for the development of the courtly love tradition in literature, a lasting influence on European culture. Let's consider the queen's role in justice. While the king was the ultimate judge, the queen often had the right to intercede and beg for mercy on behalf of a condemned person. This was a powerful and highly symbolic act. By publicly pleading for a life, the queen embodied the merciful and compassionate aspect of royal power, balancing the king's stern justice. This was, however, a carefully staged piece of theater. The king would often know in advance that the queen was going to make such a plea, allowing him to grant it as a sign of his own magnanimity and his affection for his wife. The crown itself is the perfect metaphor. It was immensely heavy, both literally and figuratively. Made of solid gold and studded with precious gems, it was physically burdensome to wear. But its symbolic weight was far greater. It represented the crushing weight of expectation, the constant scrutiny, the political maneuvering, the dynastic pressure, and the ever-present danger that defined the life of a medieval queen. To wear it was to accept a life of gilded servitude, a life where her own hopes, dreams, and desires would always be secondary to the brutal demands of the throne. The romance of the medieval court is a powerful myth, but the reality for a queen was a world governed by contracts. Her marriage was a contract. Her dower rights were a contract. The alliances she represented were based on treaties. Her relationships with the powerful nobles at court were a series of unwritten social contracts based on patronage and obligation. It was a world of cold, hard calculation, where a queen's success depended on her ability to understand and manipulate these contracts to her advantage. A far cry from the spontaneous, love-filled world of fairy tales. The queen's beauty could be both an asset and a liability. A beautiful queen could captivate the court and her husband, enhancing her influence and popularity. But beauty was fleeting. As she aged, gave birth to multiple children, or suffered from illness, her looks would fade, and with them, potentially, her husband's interest and her own informal power. Furthermore, Exceptional beauty could attract unwanted attention or jealousy, making her a target for court intrigue. It was a temporary gift that could not be relied upon in the long, brutal game of politics. Let's not forget the sheer monotony of ritual. Court life was governed by a strict and complex set of etiquette. How one addressed the king and queen, who could sit in their presence, the order in which people entered a room, all of it was rigidly prescribed. For the queen, this meant her life was a series of predictable, repetitive ceremonies. These rituals were designed to underscore the power and majesty of the monarchy, but for the woman at the center of them, they must have contributed to a sense of being an icon rather than a person, a cog in a grand, impersonal machine. The queen was the ultimate other at court. If she was foreign-born, she was an outsider by nationality and language. As a woman, she was an outsider in a world of male power. Her role was unique, and this uniqueness created a profound sense of separation from everyone around her. She could have companions, but no true peers. This isolation at the very pinnacle of the social ladder is one of the most poignant and brutal truths of her existence. She was surrounded by a crowd, but was always, in a fundamental way, alone. The pressure to be perfect was relentless. A queen was expected to be the ideal woman, pious, beautiful, fertile, gracious, wise, and obedient. Any deviation from this impossible standard could be seized upon by her critics. If she was too pious, she might be accused of neglecting her worldly duties. If she was too involved in politics, she was an unnatural meddler. If she was too reserved, she was cold and arrogant. She was walking a tightrope, and the slightest misstep could lead to a fall. A queen's friendship with other women, while a potential source of comfort, was also fraught with political danger. A close friendship with a particular lady-in-waiting could be interpreted as favoritism, alienating other noble families at court. These relationships had to be managed with the same political calculation as any other alliance. The simple human need for a trusted friend was something a queen had to subordinate to the demands of her political position. Every relationship was transactional. What about moments of joy? Surely they existed. The birth of a healthy child, a successful diplomatic negotiation, a genuine moment of affection from her husband, the success of her children. These moments must have been intensely treasured, shining lights in a life that was often filled with shadow and anxiety. But these joys were almost always tied to the successful performance of her duties. Her happiness was contingent on her success in the role that had been assigned to her, a stark contrast to our modern pursuit of personal, unconditional happiness. The brutal truth is that a medieval queen was a paradox made flesh. She was a symbol of feminine grace in a world of masculine violence. She was a figure of national unity who was often a foreigner and an outsider. She was a wielder of immense soft power who held almost no formal authority. She was a mother whose children were instruments of the state. Her life was a constant negotiation between these conflicting realities, a testament to the resilience and complexity of women who navigated a world designed to limit them. So we end where we began, with the image of a queen in a castle. But now, that image is changed. We see the stone not as grand, but as cold. We see the crown not as a prize, but as a burden. And we see the woman wearing it not as a fairy tale princess, but as a survivor, a politician, a manager, and a mother fighting for her place in a brutal, unforgiving world. Her story is not about happily ever after. It's about enduring, day after day, in the face of overwhelming pressure. The greatest fairy tale of all is the one that tells us their lives were easy. The truth is far more compelling. It's a story of strength, cunning, and the quiet, desperate courage it took to be a queen. It's a story written not in the language of romance, but in the cold, hard prose of survival. And that is a story far more worthy of being remembered. Let's consider the queen's role in warfare. While queens like Matilda and Margaret of Anjou led armies out of necessity, a queen's more common role during wartime was to act as regent. When the king was away on campaign, which could be for months or even years, the queen was often left in charge of the kingdom. She would have to govern, raise funds for the war effort, and defend the realm against internal rebellion or foreign invasion. This was an immense responsibility, a trial by fire. A queen who successfully managed the kingdom in her husband's absence would earn immense respect and political capital. A queen who failed could face disastrous consequences for herself and the kingdom. The queen's personal wealth was a critical component of her power. Her dower lands and personal income gave her a degree of financial independence that was rare for women of the time. She could use this wealth to build her own affinity of loyal followers, knights and nobles who were financially beholden to her rather than to the king. This gave her a power base that was entirely her own. However, as we saw with Joanna of Navarre, this wealth could also make her a target. A king in need of cash might see his wealthy wife or stepmother as a convenient source of funds, and could use his power to seize her assets under a thin legal pretext. The physical dangers of the castle extended beyond the cold and damp. Fire was a constant and terrifying threat. With open hearths, countless candles, and structures made largely of wood and draped in tapestries, a stray spark could quickly become a raging inferno. A castle fire was incredibly difficult to fight and could be a death trap. Furthermore, the very structure of the castle, with its uneven stone steps, dark corridors, and high battlements, made accidents a common occurrence. A simple fall could be fatal. The queen's magnificent home was, in many ways, a hazardous environment. Let's discuss the queen's relationship with the common people. She was a remote and almost celestial figure to most of her subjects, seen only on rare ceremonial occasions. Her role as a charitable patron and a merciful intercessor was crucial in shaping a positive public image. Legends and ballads would be told about the, quote, good queen, creating a bond of affection between the monarch and the populace. This popularity could be a significant political asset. A beloved queen could inspire loyalty to the dynasty, while an unpopular one could become a focal point for discontent and rebellion. Her reputation among the common folk mattered. The queen's relationship with her husband's illegitimate children could be another source of tension. It was common for kings to have children outside of marriage, and these children were often acknowledged and raised at court. The queen was expected to tolerate their presence. This must have been a difficult and humiliating situation. These children were a constant, living reminder of her husband's infidelity. Moreover, a powerful and ambitious royal bastard could be seen as a potential threat to the queen's own children and their claim to the throne, adding another layer of complexity and potential conflict to the family dynamic at court. The symbolism of the queen's coronation was profound. It was a separate ceremony from her husband's, a moment when she was formally anointed and crowned. The anointing with holy oil was particularly significant, as it invested her with a sacred quasi-priestly character. It elevated her above all other women in the realm and gave her a divine mandate to fulfill her role. This religious sanction was a powerful source of her authority and legitimacy. It declared that her position as queen was not just a matter of marriage, but a matter of God's will. When we think of a queen's power, we must consider her seal. A queen had her own personal seal, which was used to authenticate official documents issued under her authority, such as grants of land from her dower properties or letters of appointment for her household officials. The seal was a tangible symbol of her legal and administrative authority. It showed that she was not just a figurehead, but a woman with real, albeit limited, executive power. The documents bearing her seal were legally binding, a testament to her status as a distinct center of power within the kingdom. The queen's household was not just the people who lived with her in the castle. It was a vast network of estates, manors, and castles that made up her dower lands. As the lady of these lands, she was responsible for their administration, for appointing officials, and for dispensing justice to her tenants. She was, in effect, a great feudal lord in her own right. This gave her practical experience in governance and a deep understanding of the economic and social realities of the kingdom. It was a training ground where a smart queen could hone the skills she needed to navigate the wider political world. Let's consider the queen's role in the raising of noble children. It was common for the children of high-ranking nobles to be sent to be fostered at the royal court. The boys would serve as pages, and the girls would become companions to the queen's ladies-in-waiting. This was a great honor for the noble families, but it was also a clever political move by the monarch. It placed the children of potentially rival families under the king's control, effectively making them high-status hostages for their parents' good behavior. The queen would oversee the upbringing of these children, giving her a unique opportunity to build relationships and foster loyalty with the next generation of the kingdom's elite. The mental gymnastics required to be a successful queen were extraordinary. She had to be pious but not sanctimonious, intelligent but not overbearing, influential but not manipulative, and strong but not masculine. She had to constantly adapt her persona to suit the situation and the audience. She had to be a loving wife to a man she may not have chosen, a devoted mother to children who were state assets, and a gracious leader to a court full of rivals. This constant need to be all things to all people, while navigating a minefield of political and personal dangers, speaks to a level of psychological fortitude that is truly awe-inspiring. The Queen's library, if she had one, was a window into her mind and a source of her soft power. While books were rare and precious, a wealthy and educated queen could assemble a collection of religious texts, romances, and classical works. This library was not just for her personal edification. By patronizing authors and commissioning translations, she could influence the literary culture of her time. By sharing her books with her ladies and other courtiers, she could disseminate ideas and shape the intellectual conversation at court. Her library was a subtle but potent tool for cultural influence. The Queen's garden was one of the few places where she might find a semblance of peace and privacy. The herber, a small, enclosed garden, often planted with fragrant herbs and flowers, was a common feature of medieval castles. It was a space associated with the queen and her ladies, a small patch of cultivated nature in a world of cold stone. Here, she could walk, talk with her companions, or simply sit in a rare moment of tranquility. But even this sanctuary was symbolic, representing the idealized, enclosed, and controlled nature of feminine virtue in the medieval mindset. The queen's role as a consumer was economically significant. The demand from the queen's household for luxury goods, fine cloth, furs, jewels, spices, and wine drove trade and supported a network of skilled artisans and merchants. Her tastes and preferences could make or break fortunes. This economic power, while indirect, was substantial. By choosing to patronize local weavers or foreign merchants, she could impact the economic life of the kingdom in very real ways. Her shopping list was, in its own way, a document of state. The queen's death was as political as her life. The question of her burial was a matter of high importance. To be buried beside her husband in a royal mausoleum like Westminster Abbey or the Basilica of Saint-Denis in France was the ultimate statement of her legitimacy and her importance to the dynasty. The design of her tomb, her effigy, and the inscription would all be carefully planned to project a specific, idealized memory of her reign. It was the final act in the lifelong performance of queenship, ensuring that her image would continue to serve the dynasty long after she was gone. The very air of the castle was a political landscape. Who stood where in the queen's presence, who was granted a private audience, who was invited to her table, these were not casual matters. They were carefully calibrated signals of favor or disfavor, closely watched by everyone at court. A queen could reward an ally with a position of honor in her household, or punish a rival by publicly ignoring them. She had to be a master of this nonverbal language of power, as it was one of the primary ways she could manage her relationships and maintain her influence in the intricate dance of court life. The pressure of succession did not end with the birth of one son. A single male heir was a fragile thing. In an age of high infant mortality and disease, a queen was expected to produce an heir and a spare, and preferably more than one spare. The more sons she had, the more secure the dynasty. This meant that the cycle of pregnancy and life-threatening childbirth was not a one-time ordeal, but a recurring duty that she might have to face half a dozen times or more. The physical toll on her body is hard to imagine, a constant sacrifice for the future of the kingdom. The concept of courtly love, often associated with queens like Eleanor of Aquitaine, was a literary ideal, not a social reality. It was a game of stylized flirtation and poetic devotion, where a knight would dedicate his deeds to a high-born, unattainable lady. This was a fantasy. In the real world, any hint of actual infidelity on the part of a queen was a catastrophic, treasonous act. The romantic ideals of the troubadours existed in stark contrast to the brutal reality of the queen's life, where her body was the property of the state and her fidelity had to be absolute. Let's consider the queen's role in royal progresses. The itinerant court did not just move for sanitation purposes, it was a political tool. By traveling through the kingdom, the king and queen made their power visible to their subjects. These progresses were massive, expensive undertakings. The queen would be expected to play her part, dispensing charity, receiving local dignitaries, and generally putting on a show of royal splendor. It was an exhausting and relentless tour of duty, designed to reinforce the bonds of loyalty between the crown and the country through sheer presence. The queen's relationship with the law was complex. She was not above the law, but she was also not subject to it in the same way as a commoner. An accusation against a queen was a grave political matter, not just a legal one. As we saw with Joanna of Navarre and Anne Boleyn later on, a trial against a queen was often a show trial, with the verdict decided in advance for political reasons. The law was a tool that could be used to protect her, but it could also be twisted and used to destroy her by her enemies. The brutal truth is that the medieval queen was an institution before she was a person. She stepped into a role with a script that had been written for centuries. Her job was to play that part to perfection. Her personal feelings, her individual talents, her private desires, all had to be subsumed into the institutional identity of the queen. To survive, she had to learn to live inside that role, to find spaces for her own agency within its rigid confines. The women who we remember are the ones who either played the part brilliantly or who dared to rewrite the script entirely. The queen's spiritual life provided a language for her power. In an age of faith, piety was a universally understood virtue. By positioning herself as a devout and holy woman, a queen could gain a moral authority that transcended the political sphere. Her prayers were seen as powerful, her charity as a source of divine blessing. This spiritual authority was one of the few forms of power that was considered legitimate and natural for a woman to wield. A savvy queen understood this and used her piety as both a shield and a weapon in the treacherous court environment. The material culture of the queen's life was a constant broadcast of her status. The tapestries that adorned the cold stone walls did more than just provide insulation. They depicted scenes from history or romance that reinforced the dynasty's right to rule. The gold and silver plates used at her table were not just for eating. They were a display of wealth that could be melted down to pay for armies in times of war. Every object that surrounded her was imbued with a political and symbolic meaning, part of the constant, elaborate theater of monarchy. Let's look at the second queen, the king's new wife after the first has died or been set aside. This was an incredibly difficult position. The new queen had to contend with the memory of her predecessor, who might have been beloved by the people or the court. She might have to act as a stepmother to the king's children from his first marriage, who might resent her as an interloper. She had to immediately face the pressure of producing her own heirs to secure her new position. The court would constantly compare her to the queen who came before, making it a struggle to establish her own identity and authority. The queen's health was a matter of state. Any illness she suffered would be the subject of intense speculation and prayer. Physicians would be summoned, their every pronouncement scrutinized. This was not just out of concern for her well-being, but because her health was directly tied to the stability of the realm. If she was of childbearing age, her illness could delay the production of an heir. If she was a regent, her incapacitation could create a power vacuum. Her body was a public concern, and she could not even be sick in private. The very concept of childhood was different for a future queen. From a very young age, she would be groomed for her future role. Her education, her companions, and her daily activities were all designed to prepare her for a political marriage. Play would be mixed with lessons in etiquette and diplomacy. She was raised not as a girl but as a future political asset. This early conditioning for a life of duty and public scrutiny meant that she likely never experienced the carefree freedom that we associate with childhood. Her life's path was set before she could even choose it. The queen's role as a hostess was a key part of her diplomatic function. When foreign ambassadors or visiting dignitaries came to court, it was the queen who presided over the entertainments. The feasts, the dances, the tournaments, all were under her purview. This was her stage to display the wealth, culture, and power of the kingdom. A successful event could smooth diplomatic relations and enhance the kingdom's prestige. A poorly managed one could cause offense and create a diplomatic incident. It was a high-stakes form of party planning. The queen's ladies-in-waiting formed a, quote, second court around her, a sphere of female influence in society within the larger, male-dominated court. This household could be a place of culture, conversation, and companionship. It was where the queen's own language and customs might be preserved, a small island of her native culture in a foreign sea. However, it could also be a hotbed of intrigue and rivalry, as her ladies vied for her favor and for advantageous positions for themselves and their families. The queen had to be the firm ruler of this small kingdom within a kingdom. The queen's signature on a document was a powerful thing. While she might not have been a warrior or a lawmaker in the same way as the king, her written assent was often required for certain grants or legal acts, particularly those concerning her own properties or household. This literacy and legal standing set her apart from the vast majority of people, including many male nobles. It was a tangible form of her authority, a reminder that she was a legal and political entity in her own right, not just an extension of her husband. Let's consider the queen's relationship with the king's chief ministers. These powerful men, the chancellor, the treasurer, the chamberlain, were the engines of royal government. A wise queen would cultivate good relationships with them, as they could be powerful allies. They could help her navigate the complexities of the court, advocate for her interests, and keep her informed. However, if she was seen as a threat or a rival for the king's ear, these same men could become her most dangerous enemies, working to isolate her and undermine her influence. It was a delicate political dance. The final, brutal truth is that a queen was ultimately expendable. If she failed to produce an heir, if her political alliance became inconvenient, or if the king simply grew tired of her, she could be set aside. A marriage could be annulled on flimsy grounds, such as a distant blood relationship that had been previously ignored. She could be packed off to a convent or imprisoned. Her entire world, her status, her wealth, her security, even her connection to her children, could be taken away from her at the whim of her husband and the political needs of the state. This fundamental precariousness was the dark shadow that hung over even the most successful queen. The queen's role in justice extended to her own tenants on her dower lands. She would preside over her own manorial courts, settling disputes over land, contracts, and petty crimes. This was a direct exercise of judicial power. It gave her a reputation for being a just and fair-minded ruler among her own people, which could bolster her popularity in the wider kingdom. It was another example of the real, tangible authority she wielded, a world away from the passive, decorative role often depicted in fiction. The queen's personal motto and badges, which would be embroidered on her belongings and displayed by her retinue, were a form of personal branding. They communicated her identity, her aspirations, or her political allegiance. For example, a queen might choose a motto that emphasized her piety or her loyalty. These symbols were a way for her to project her own persona into the public sphere, a subtle but constant assertion of her individual identity within the institution of the monarchy. The physical toll of medieval life was immense, even for a queen. Beyond childbirth, the risk of injury was high. Riding was a primary mode of transportation, and a fall from a horse could be deadly. Dental health was abysmal, and a toothache could become a life-threatening infection. The lack of understanding of nutrition and disease meant that people aged quickly. A queen in her 40s would likely have been considered a venerable old woman. The long and happy life of fairy tale endings was a statistical improbability. Let's reconsider the concept of the she-wolf. While Isabella of France was given this name, it speaks to a broader archetype. Any queen who asserted herself too forcefully, who stepped outside the bounds of expected feminine behavior, was at risk of being labeled as monstrous or unnatural. It was a way for a patriarchal society to police the boundaries of female power. The label was a warning to other women. Be pious, be obedient, be a mother, but do not dare to be a ruler in your own right, or you too will be remembered as a wolf, not a woman. The queen's access to information was a key source of her power. Through her network of ladies-in-waiting, her personal confessor, and her contacts in foreign courts, often her own family, a savvy queen could be one of the best-informed people in the kingdom. She could gather intelligence that was not available to the king's official council. This knowledge was a valuable currency. She could use it to advise her husband, to anticipate political shifts, or to outmaneuver her rivals. She was the informal spymaster of the court. The queen's role in arranging marriages for her ladies-in-waiting and other nobles was a significant form of patronage. By brokering a good match, she could indebt two powerful families to her personally. It was a way of playing political chess, building a web of alliances that strengthened her own position and that of the crown. This matchmaking was not about romance. It was about the strategic consolidation of power, and the queen was often the master strategist at the center of the board. The very act of dressing the queen each morning was a ceremony. Her ladies-in-waiting would attend her, each with a specific role in the ritual. This was not about simple practicality. It was about reinforcing the hierarchy of the court. The honor of handing the queen her shift or her gown was a sign of high favor. The daily routine was a constant reminder to everyone of her exalted status and their place in the social order. Her life had no offstage moments. The queen's pilgrimage was another public performance of piety, a journey to a major shrine like Canterbury in England, or Santiago de Compostela in Spain was a major undertaking. It was a way for the queen to seek divine favor, perhaps for the birth of an heir or the success of her husband in battle. But it was also a political tour, allowing her to be seen by her people in a context of profound holiness. It was a powerful piece of public relations, blending personal faith with political expediency. The Queen's relationship with the City of London, or the major city of the kingdom, was crucial. These cities were centers of wealth and commerce, and their loyalty was vital to the crown. A queen would often have a special ceremonial relationship with the city's leaders. Her formal entry into the city after her wedding or coronation was a major public spectacle, with elaborate pageants staged in her honor. By cultivating a good relationship with the city's powerful merchants and guilds, she could help secure financial and political support for the monarchy. The fundamental truth is that the life of a medieval queen was a life of profound insecurity. Her position, her wealth, and her very safety were dependent on a series of fragile conditions: her fertility, her husband's political fortunes, and the shifting sands of court politics. She could be the most powerful woman in the land one day, and a prisoner the next. This constant underlying precarity is the defining feature of her existence, and it is the element most conspicuously absent from our modern fairy tale retellings. Let us think about the Queen's voice. We have discussed her actions and her roles, but what of her actual, literal voice? In a world where men made the speeches and issued the commands, a queen's power often lay in the whisper. A whispered word of advice to the king in the bedchamber, a quiet conversation with an ambassador, a rumor discreetly started among her ladies. She had to master the art of indirect influence, of achieving her goals not through public proclamation, but through the subtle, often invisible, currents of court conversation. Her power was often in what was said in private, not in public. The Queen's jewels were not simply personal adornments. They were part of the crown treasury, state assets. In times of financial crisis, the Queen might be expected to pawn her precious necklaces and rings to raise money for an army or to pay off state debts. Her personal wealth and the kingdom's wealth were intertwined. The same jewels that signified her power and status on a feast day could be converted into cash to fund a war the next day. They were a beautiful, portable symbol of the kingdom's financial reserves. The Queen's role as a mother extended beyond her own children. She was seen as a symbolic mother to the entire kingdom. This maternal role required her to be compassionate, merciful, and nurturing. It was a powerful and popular image, but it was also confining. It reinforced the idea that a woman's authority should be soft, domestic, and indirect, rather than hard, public, and direct like a king's. The mother of the nation archetype was both a source of influence and a cage. The Queen's hunting expeditions were more than just sport. They were military exercises in miniature. The logistics of a royal hunt, organizing beaters, handlers, and a large retinue, were complex. It was a display of the court's organizational prowess. For the Queen, it was also one of the few areas where she could participate in an activity that mirrored the masculine pursuit of warfare. It was a socially acceptable outlet for aggression and a display of physical courage and skill, all within the carefully controlled context of a courtly pastime. The Queen's grief was a public performance. When a member of the royal family died, the Queen was expected to lead the mourning. Her display of sorrow had to be both profound and dignified, a model for the entire kingdom. She would go into a period of seclusion, wearing somber clothes, and her behavior would be closely watched. She could not simply grieve in private. Her sorrow was a state ceremony, another duty to be performed with the appropriate gravity, regardless of her true feelings. The Queen's quote of love, a concept from romance literature, where highborn ladies would debate questions of love and relationships, was a fantasy. The reality of a queen's court was a, quote, court of power. The conversations were not about abstract romantic dilemmas. They were about marriages, alliances, land grants, and political appointments. The currency was not love, but influence. The Queen presided not over a literary salon, but over a political clearinghouse, and the stakes were infinitely higher. Let's consider the Queen's legacy in the built environment. A powerful and wealthy queen might commission the building of a chapel, a bridge, or even a college, as Margaret of Anjou did with Queen's College, Cambridge. These architectural projects were a way for her to leave a permanent, physical mark on the kingdom. They were monuments to her piety, her wealth, and her influence. Long after her political power had faded, the stone and glass of her foundations would remain, a lasting testament to her presence and her legacy. The Queen's diet was a reflection of medieval medical theory. Certain foods were considered hot or cold, wet or dry, corresponding to the four humors. A physician might advise the Queen to eat certain foods to maintain the balance of her humors and thus her health. For example, fish was considered cold and moist, while wine was hot and dry. Her meals were not just a matter of taste, but a form of preventative medicine, a constant and often misguided effort to maintain her health in a world with little understanding of disease. The Queen was the emotional anchor of the court. She was expected to maintain her composure in moments of crisis, to be a source of stability when the king was angry or indecisive. This role as the calm, serene center of a turbulent world was incredibly demanding. She had to absorb the anxieties of the court and project an aura of tranquility and control, even when she herself was frightened or uncertain. Her emotional regulation was a political tool, essential for maintaining the stability and decorum of the court. Ultimately, the brutal truth about being a queen was the sheer, crushing weight of responsibility. She was responsible for the future of the dynasty through her children. She was responsible for the smooth running of the massive royal household. She was responsible for representing the kingdom with grace and splendor. She was responsible for acting as a diplomat and mediator. And she had to bear all these responsibilities while navigating a system that was fundamentally designed to limit her power and agency. It was a life of extraordinary duty, and the price of failure was catastrophic. The queen's relationship with the king's favorite was a particularly treacherous dynamic. As seen with Isabella of France and Piers Gaveston, the favorite could become a rival for the king's affection, resources, and political attention. The queen had to navigate this with extreme care. To openly oppose the favorite could be to oppose the king himself. To tolerate them could mean her own marginalization. She had to play a long and subtle game, perhaps trying to win the favorite over as an ally, or quietly working with other discontented nobles to undermine his position. It was a toxic and dangerous situation, with no easy solution. Let's consider the queen's role in the royal nursery. She would appoint the nurses, tutors, and guardians for her children, but she would not raise them in the hands-on way a modern mother would. The princes and princesses had their own household from a very young age. The queen's relationship with her children was often formal and intermittent, punctuated by ceremonial visits. This separation was not due to a lack of love, but to the understanding that these were not ordinary children. They were state assets whose upbringing was too important to be left to the private sphere of the family alone. The tapestries that followed the court from castle to castle were the medieval equivalent of a corporate branding campaign. They depicted stories that legitimized the ruling dynasty, great victories, noble lineages, or biblical justifications for their rule. When the queen sat in front of these tapestries, she was literally framed by the propaganda of the regime. They were a constant visual reminder to all who saw her of the power and history she represented. They transformed a cold stone hall into a throne room and a statement of power. The queen's charitable giving was not random. It was a carefully managed portfolio of patronage. She would support specific abbeys, convents, or hospitals, making them part of her political and spiritual network. In return for her financial support, these institutions would offer prayers for her and the royal family, enhancing her spiritual reputation. They would also be sources of local intelligence and could be counted on for loyalty. Her charity was a strategic investment, yielding both spiritual and political dividends. The silence of many queens in the historical record is itself a brutal truth. For every Eleanor of Aquitaine or Isabella of France whose dramatic life was recorded by chroniclers, there are dozens of queens who passed through history almost without a trace. They were born, they married, they had children, and they died. Their personal thoughts, their struggles, their triumphs are lost to us. This silence speaks to the reality for the average queen, who successfully fulfilled her duties without causing a political crisis and was therefore not considered newsworthy. She was a successful institution and therefore an invisible person. The queen's bed was a political landscape. The ceremony of the bedding, where the newly married couple were formally put to bed by the court, was a public confirmation that the marriage was consummated and the path to an heir was open. The very act of intimacy was a state-sanctioned event. Even beyond the wedding night, the king's decision to sleep with the queen was a matter of public observation. It signaled her continued favor and the ongoing project of producing heirs. The royal bedchamber was the most private and yet the most public room in the entire castle. Let's consider the reality of medieval warfare for a queen inside a besieged castle. It was not a distant event. She would hear the sounds of battle, see the wounded being brought in, and experience the terror of a potential assault. She would have to endure the privations of the siege, dwindling food and water supplies, the spread of disease in crowded conditions. Her role would be to maintain morale, particularly among the women and children, and to project an image of calm defiance. It was a terrifying, first-hand experience of the brutality of war. The queen's role in the quote, chain of being was to be the link between the king and the rest of the female population. She was the model for all other women to aspire to in her piety, her modesty, and her obedience. Her life was a lesson in the proper role of women in a divinely ordered society. This made her a powerful symbol of the social order. Any transgression on her part was not just a personal failing, it was a crack in the very fabric of society, which is why queens who defied the norms were treated with such hostility by contemporary writers. The Queen's Council, an informal group of advisors drawn from her household and her noble allies, was her private cabinet. It was here that she could speak more freely, strategize, and formulate the advice she would give to the king. A successful queen was an expert manager of this council, listening to different viewpoints and building a consensus. This informal body was the engine of her political influence, a hidden source of power that operated in the shadows of the king's official council. The brutal truth is that a queen's body was never her own. It was a dynastic vessel, a political symbol, and a subject of public scrutiny. Her fertility determined her value. Her fidelity was a matter of state security. Her health was a national concern. Her beauty was a political asset. From her marriage to her deathbed, her physical form was objectified and politicized. The profound lack of bodily autonomy is perhaps the most shocking and brutal reality for a modern observer to comprehend. She was the most revered woman in the land, and the least free. The Queen's relationship with the arts often had a political subtext. The romances she commissioned might contain subtle allegories praising her own family or homeland. The religious manuscripts she paid for would emphasize saints or stories that resonated with her own situation. Art was not just for entertainment, it was a sophisticated form of propaganda. Through her patronage, a queen could shape the narrative of her time and subtly advance her own agenda, all under the guise of cultural enrichment. The queen's daily routine was a relentless performance of her status. The procession to chapel, the formal meals in the Great Hall, the ceremony of giving audience, every event was structured to emphasize her royal dignity. There were no casual Fridays in a medieval court. This constant, unyielding formality must have been psychologically taxing, forcing her to always be, to always inhabit the public role of the queen with little space for her private self to breathe. The queen's dowry, the property and money she brought to the marriage, was a critical factor in her marriage negotiations. It was a measure of her family's wealth and status. While this dowry was often controlled by her husband, it was legally hers. A large dowry gave a queen a degree of leverage and importance. It also meant that sending her back in disgrace was a costly proposition, as her dowry would have to be returned. Her financial value was a key component of her security. Let's reconsider the ladies-in-waiting. They were not servants, they were noble companions. Their presence was a mark of the queen's status. The more high-born ladies she had in her retinue, the greater her prestige. They formed a glittering court around her, a constant display of her power, to attract the loyalty of the kingdom's elite families. But this also meant she was living in a fishbowl, constantly observed by the daughters and wives of the most powerful men in the realm. The queen's role in festivals like Christmas or Easter was central. The court would celebrate with massive feasts, elaborate entertainments, and public displays of charity. The queen would be at the heart of these celebrations, presiding over the festivities and embodying the spirit of royal largesse and piety. These events were crucial for the monarchy's public relations, a way of displaying its wealth and its generosity to the people. For the queen, it was another major administrative and ceremonial duty. The queen's signature style could have a lasting impact. A queen from a foreign country might introduce new fashions, new foods, or new customs to the court. If she was popular and influential, these could be adopted and become part of the national culture. This cultural exchange was a subtle but important aspect of her role. She was a bridge between her homeland and her new kingdom, and the traffic across that bridge flowed in both directions. The queen's relationship with the king's legitimate children from a previous marriage was a minefield. She had to be a caring stepmother to them, but also ensure the precedence of her own sons. Any perceived favoritism towards her own children could create resentment and factionalism within the royal family. It was an incredibly delicate balancing act, requiring immense diplomatic skill to maintain harmony in a family that was also a political dynasty. The very architecture of the queen's chambers was designed for her role. She would typically have an outer presence chamber for receiving guests, an inner privy chamber for more private audiences, and finally her bedchamber. Access to these spaces was strictly controlled. To be admitted to the privy chamber was a sign of great favor. The layout of her rooms was a physical map of the court's power structure, and one's position in that structure determined how far into her private world you were allowed to go. The queen's role as a landed magnate meant she had to have a working knowledge of agriculture, estate management, and local law. She would receive regular reports from the stewards who managed her dower lands. She would have to approve expenses, resolve disputes among her tenants, and make decisions about things like crop rotation or the sale of wool. This was the unglamorous, practical side of her power, and it was a significant source of her wealth and influence. The brutal truth is that a queen's success was often defined by things entirely outside of her control. She could be the most intelligent, pious, and capable woman in the world, but if she was infertile, she was a failure. She could secure a powerful alliance with her marriage, but if international politics shifted, that alliance could become worthless, and so could she. She was a player in a game where the rules could change at any moment, and where luck, biological and political, often counted for more than skill. Let's think about the queen's role in the education of her daughters. While her sons' education would be overseen by men to prepare them for rule, the queen would have a more direct hand in grooming her daughters for their own political marriages. She would teach them the languages, etiquette, and political savvy they would need to survive in a foreign court. In doing so, she was perpetuating the very system that had defined her own life, preparing her own child for a life of gilded servitude. This must have been a poignant and perhaps painful duty. The queen's seal often depicted her standing, holding a scepter or a book, a dignified and serene figure. This was the official, sanctioned image of queenship, calm, pious, and authoritative in a passive way. It stands in stark contrast to the turbulent reality of many queens' lives. The serene image on the wax seal was the ideal, while the reality was often a desperate struggle for survival. The gap between the symbol and the person is where the brutal truth of her existence lies. The queen's confessor was a figure of immense intimacy and power. He was the one person to whom she was supposed to reveal her innermost thoughts and sins. This created a powerful bond, but it was also a vulnerability. A confessor could use his knowledge to manipulate the queen, or he could be a spy for a rival faction. Choosing a confessor was one of the most important political appointments a queen would make, as her very soul was in his hands. The queen's gifts were a form of currency. The New Year's gift exchange was a major court ceremony where the queen would give and receive valuable presents from the king and the major nobles. The value of the gift given and received was a public statement of a person standing in the court. A queen had to be a shrewd gift giver, ensuring that her presents were lavish enough to maintain her prestige, but also carefully calibrated to the status of the recipient. It was a complex social and political ritual. The queen was the living embodiment of the kingdom's alliance with her home country. This made her a symbol of peace. However, if war broke out between her husband's kingdom and her father's, she was placed in an impossible position. Her loyalties would be questioned, and she could be seen as an enemy alien, a potential spy or traitor in the heart of the court. Her very presence, once a symbol of peace, would become a symbol of a failed policy and a source of dangerous suspicion. The medieval concept of fortune's wheel was a powerful one. It taught that a person's station in life could change in an instant, that a king could become a beggar overnight. No one was more aware of this than a queen. Her position was so high, but so precarious, that she was a living example of fortune's whims. The stories of queens who were deposed, imprisoned, or executed were a constant, terrifying reminder that the wheel could turn at any moment, and her fall from the top would be a long and brutal one. The queen's role in the royal Maundy Thursday ceremony was highly symbolic. She would wash the feet of poor women, imitating Christ washing the feet of his apostles. This act of ritual humility was a powerful performance of piety and compassion. It showed the queen, in all her splendor, humbling herself to serve the lowest of her subjects. It was a carefully staged piece of theater designed to reinforce her image as a good and holy queen, the mother of her people. The queen's physicians were often at the forefront of medieval medical science, but this was not always a good thing. They might experiment with new and dangerous treatments on their royal patient. The queen's body was a site for medical innovation, but in an age of primitive understanding, this innovation could be deadly. The treatments she received, from bizarre herbal concoctions to aggressive bloodletting, could often be more dangerous than the illness they were intended to cure. The queen's personal accounts were a record of her life and priorities. By studying the expenses of a queen's household, historians can learn what she ate, what she wore, what books she read, and to whom she gave gifts and charity. These dry financial records are often the most intimate glimpse we have into her daily existence. They reveal a woman who was a meticulous administrator, a major economic player, and the head of a vast and complex organization. They reveal the CEO behind the crown. The brutal truth is that a queen's life was one of constant, unending performance. She was performing the role of the devoted wife, the fertile mother, the pious Christian, the gracious hostess, and the serene symbol of the kingdom. Every gesture, every word, every public appearance was part of this performance. The space between the woman and the role she was forced to play must have been, at times, a lonely and terrifying chasm. The most successful queens were simply the most accomplished actors. Let's consider the queen's relationship with magic and superstition. In a world where science was limited, belief in omens, prophecies, and witchcraft was widespread. A queen might consult an astrologer before making a major decision, or wear an amulet to ward off illness or the evil eye. But this belief could also be weaponized against her. An accusation of witchcraft, as Joanna of Navarre discovered, was a deadly and almost indefensible charge, a way to eliminate a political rival under the guise of piety. The queen's role as a patron of learning could have a profound impact. By funding schools or colleges, she could shape the educational landscape of the kingdom for generations. By commissioning translations of important texts, she could make knowledge more widely available. This was a long-term form of power, a way of influencing the future by investing in the minds of its future leaders. It was one of the most lasting and positive legacies a queen could leave. The queen's food tasters were a stark reminder of the dangers she faced. The fact that she could not simply eat a meal without fearing it was poisoned speaks volumes about the atmosphere of suspicion at court. This single detail cuts through all the romance of the era. Imagine living a life where you need someone to risk death for you before you can eat your dinner. It's a chilling illustration of the constant, low-level terror that was part of the fabric of her life. The queen's relationship with the king's army was distant but important. She would be expected to bless the troops before they went into battle and to pray for their victory. She might embroider a special banner for the king to carry. She was the symbolic, spiritual heart of the war effort, the figure for whom the knights were supposedly fighting. Her role was to inspire, to sanctify the violence of men with her feminine piety. The queen's gardens were not just for pleasure, they were also her pharmacy. They would cultivate a wide variety of herbs that were used for medicinal purposes. The queen and her ladies would have a working knowledge of herbal remedies for common ailments. This was a form of domestic science, a body of female knowledge passed down through generations. In a world of dangerous physicians, a queen's own herbal knowledge might be her best chance at effective healthcare. The brutal truth is that a queen was a prisoner of her own biography. Her past, her family, her homeland The political circumstances of her marriage was always with her. It could be a source of strength or a weapon used against her. She could never escape who she was and where she came from. Her identity was fixed by her birth and her marriage, and her life was a constant effort to navigate the opportunities and the constraints that her biography imposed on her. The queen's role in the pageantry of knighthood was essential. At a tournament, she would be the, quote, queen of beauty, presiding over the event and awarding the prize to the victor. The knights would compete for her favor, dedicating their jousts to her. This was a highly ritualized form of political theater, a way of binding the kingdom's warrior class to the monarchy through a display of chivalry and loyalty. The queen was the centerpiece of this powerful ritual. The queen's correspondence was a vital tool of diplomacy. Her letters to her family in foreign courts could be a back-channel for sensitive negotiations, away from the prying eyes of official ambassadors. She could use her family connections to gather intelligence, to smooth over diplomatic incidents, or to advocate for her husband's policies. Her personal letters were often state papers in disguise, a testament to the fact that, for a queen, the personal was always political. The queen's retinue on a journey was a magnificent sight, a moving city. It included not just her ladies, but also her chaplains, clerks, guards, and a vast army of servants, from cooks to grooms to laundresses. The baggage train would stretch for miles, carrying everything from her state bed to her kitchen pots. This massive procession was a deliberate display of her power and wealth, designed to awe the countryside as she passed through it. The brutal truth is that a queen's greatest strength was her resilience. She had to endure physical hardship, political betrayal, personal loss, and constant pressure. She had to be adaptable, learning to thrive in a foreign land and a hostile court. She had to be patient, waiting for the right moment to exert her influence. The queens who we remember are, above all, survivors. Their stories are monuments to the strength of the human spirit in the face of overwhelming adversity. The queen's role as a peacemaker between the king and his powerful nobles was a constant and stressful task. The king might have a falling out with a major duke or earl, and it would fall to the queen to mediate the dispute and restore harmony. She had to be a skilled diplomat within her own court, balancing the king's pride with the nobles' demands. The stability of the kingdom often rested on her ability to negotiate these internal conflicts successfully. The queen's regency, when she ruled in her son's name, was the moment of her greatest power, but also her greatest peril. She would have to contend with ambitious uncles and rival nobles who resented a woman's rule. She had to govern effectively to prove her competence and to protect her son's inheritance. A successful regency, like that of Blanche of Castile in France, could be a triumph. A failed one could lead to civil war and the downfall of her family. The queen's relationship with the past was important. She was expected to show respect for her husband's ancestors, to pray for their souls, and to uphold the traditions of the kingdom she had married into. By linking herself to the history of the dynasty, she strengthened her own legitimacy and that of her children. She had to become a part of her new family story, weaving her own thread into a tapestry that had been started long before she was born. The queen's relationship with her sons, wives, was often fraught with tension. The queen mother, who had been the first lady of the land for years, would have to cede her position to the new, young queen. This could lead to a rivalry for influence over the king. The court would often be divided into factions, the old queen's party and the new queen's party. It was a natural consequence of a system where a woman's power was so closely tied to her relationship with the reigning king. The queen's personal piety could be a source of genuine comfort in a difficult life. Her private chapel could be a sanctuary, and her faith a source of inner strength. In a world that she could not control, her relationship with God was her own. While her piety was also a public performance, we should not discount the possibility of genuine, deep-seated faith that helped her endure the trials of her position. It may have been her only true solace. The queen's role in the cult of chivalry was to be the idealized, pure, and unattainable woman who inspired men to noble deeds. She was the audience for male heroism. This role, while seemingly exalted, was incredibly passive. It reduced her to an object of inspiration, a beautiful prize to be won, rather than an actor in her own right. The more she was celebrated in chivalric literature, the more she was confined by its narrow expectations of female behavior. The queen's financial acumen was a vital and underrated skill. She had to manage the vast budget of her own household and the income from her dower lands. A queen who was a shrewd financial administrator could amass significant personal wealth, which translated directly into political power. She could fund her own political projects, reward her followers, and make herself an indispensable partner to a king who was often short of cash. Business sense was a key tool in her survival kit. The brutal truth is that a queen's life was a public spectacle from beginning to end. Her wedding was a state celebration. Her pregnancies were a matter of national interest. Her daily routines were court ceremonies. Her illnesses were political crises. Her death was a state funeral. She had no private life, no off-duty moments. She was a person who had been transformed into a symbol, and she had to live her entire life under the bright, unforgiving lights of that public stage. The Queen's legacy was ultimately written by others. The chroniclers, poets, and historians of her time, and later, would craft her image to suit their own agendas. She would be remembered as a saint or a she-wolf, a wise counselor or a foreign schemer, a devoted mother or a political manipulator. The real woman, in all her complexity, was often lost behind the powerful archetypes. Our challenge today is to look past these simple labels and try to understand the complex, constrained, and often courageous person behind the crown. So the next time you picture that queen in her fairy tale castle, remember the reality. Remember the cold, the darkness, the constant pressure. Remember the woman who was a CEO, a diplomat, a political prisoner, and a high-stakes gambler. Her life was not a romance. It was a brutal, brilliant, and relentless Game of Thrones. And the fact that any of them survived at all is the most remarkable story of them all.